On to our other big focus on Global Pulse tonight. It's being described by the American media as the most damaging loss of Trump's second term in office. The decision of the US Supreme Court to strike down Trump's tariffs as unlawful, forcing a sweeping rollback of a controversial trade tool that has reshaped global supply chains and strained America's ties with major partners. And as a direct outcome of that, the United States will stop collecting a tranche of tariffs imposed by President Donald Trump. In a statement, the US Customs and Border Protection has said tariff collections under the 1977-era International Emergency Economic Powers Act will cease on Tuesday, instructing importers that all related tariff codes will be deactivated in its cargo systems. However, the suspension applies only to tariffs imposed under the IEEPA and does not affect other Trump-era levies, including those under Section 232, National Security Powers, and Section 301, Unfair Trade Statutes. And Trump, being Trump, has not only lashed out at the Supreme Court over this decision, he seems to have doubled down on his tariff wars. Soon after the Supreme Court verdict came, Trump announced a new 15% global trade tariff under a different legal authority to replace the duties that have been struck down, signaling a rapid pivot in US trade policy. Economists estimate the Supreme Court ruling could put more than $175 billion in US tariff revenue at risk of refunds. In a 6-3 ruling on the 20th of February, the Supreme Court affirmed lower court findings that Donald Trump exceeded his authority by invoking the IEEPA to impose sweeping import tariffs, holding that the statute did not grant the powers he claimed. As we said, within hours, Trump announced a blanket tariff on US imports from all countries, initially set at 10% and now abruptly raised to 15%. The new duties rely on Section 122 of US trade law, permitting tariffs up to 15% but requiring congressional approval if kept beyond 150 days. No US president has previously used Section 122 and legal challenges are expected. The European Union has said a deal is a deal and asked the United States to fulfill its commitments. The European Commission has said the current situation is not conducive to delivering fair, balanced and mutually beneficial transatlantic trade and investment as agreed to by both sides and spelled out in the EU-US joint statement of August 2025. American and EU officials sealed a trade deal last year that imposes a 15% import tax on 70% of European goods exported to the US. A top EU lawmaker has said he will propose to the European Parliament negotiating team to put the ratifying process of the deal on hold. Bernard Lange, the chair of the European Parliament's International Trade Committee, has said pure tariff chaos on the part of the US administration. No one can make any sense of it anymore. Only open questions and growing uncertainty for the EU and other US trading partners. The European Commission has said a deal is a deal. As the United States' largest trading partner, the EU expects the US to honor its commitments set out in the joint statement, just as the EU stands by its commitments. EU products must continue to benefit from the most competitive treatment with no increases in tariffs beyond the clear and all-inclusive ceiling previously agreed. The Commission added, when applied unpredictably, tariffs are inherently disruptive, undermining confidence and stability across global markets and creating further uncertainty across international supply chains. Jamieson Greer, Trump's top trade negotiator, has said the US plans to stand by its trade deals and expects its partners to do the same. As primarily a trading bloc, the European Union has a powerful tool at its disposal to retaliate: the bloc's anti-coercion instrument. It includes a raft of measures for blocking or restricting trade and investment from countries found to be putting undue pressure on EU member nations or corporations. So what is Donald Trump going to do? As we said, true to his philosophy of never accepting a defeat, he's already lashing out at the Supreme Court and fighting back. Trump is vowing to avenge the highly damaging loss by threatening even higher duties on imports. Many Republicans, however, would prefer a course correction as midterm elections loom. The US president's defiance brings great political risks for him and his party, and new uncertainties for an uneven economy. But he is still convinced that tariffs will unlock booming prosperity, even if the tariffs end up unleashing a heavier affordability burden on millions of American voters. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has said, what the Supreme Court said is that the president cannot use the IEEPA. But the president does have other authorities. Bessent has said that Trump will shore up his tariffs by using other laws as a 5-month bridge to a more permanent regime. Democratic Senator Andy Kim says his party is already working on legislation to force Trump to repay consumers for higher costs inflicted by his tariffs. But will Trump budge? Unlikely, say political observers. Trump's faith in tariffs is so intense, it blanks out any evidence that they are a tax on consumers or that they don't work. In fact, Trump said just 3 days ago, I have very effectively utilized tariffs over the past year to make America great again. Ignoring new data that shows an unmoving annual trade deficit and declining manufacturing jobs. And let's not forget, Trump's refusal to bend is on account of the fact that he sees tariffs as a means to his ultimate ends of unfettered presidential authority and rejection of a constitutional system which, by design, shares power across the government. This was highlighted by his most revealing comment, which he made at a very angry press conference on Friday following the Supreme Court's decision. When he was asked why he didn't just work with Congress to pass new tariffs, Donald Trump said, I don't have to. I have the right to do tariffs. Trump has used tariffs more expansively than any modern president, in a way that stretches far beyond economic policy. If a foreign nation angers him, it is punished. He slapped 50% tariffs on India last year as punishment for buying Russian oil, and possibly also for not giving him credit for the ceasefire between India and Pakistan during their brief military conflict last year, and possibly also for refusing to nominate him for the Nobel Peace Prize. Brazil got a 50% tariff slap for investigating Trump's friend, former President Jair Bolsonaro, over alleged election meddling. If a world leader shows insufficient deference, their nation pays the price. Trump has explained, for example, that he hiked tariffs on Switzerland after taking exception to how its leader, quote, talked to us, apparently referring to former President Karen Keller-Sutter. Trump has a transactional worldview. He sees curbs on his tariff leverage as weakening the US against rivals, who he perceives as endlessly exploiting the world's most powerful economy. The Supreme Court ruling may undermine his trade war ahead of expected summits with Chinese President Xi Jinping this year. Going forward, could Trump find that he is hamstrung by different legislations? Alternative powers which Trump now plans to use to maintain the tariffs contain compliance requirements and more limited authorities. That means he may no longer be able to use levies as a weapon to turn up the heat on nations according to his whim. Well, that's all the time we have on this edition of Global Pulse. Thanks for watching.